The desk sergeant on duty at the Harlow Falls Police Department on the morning of September 4th, 2009, was a 22-year veteran of the force named Carl Munier, a man who had processed hundreds of walk-ins over the course of his career and who described himself later, in a recorded statement that became part of a federal file, as someone who was no longer capable of being surprised by anything that came through the front door. He was wrong. The man who pushed through the glass door at 8:47 that morning was wearing a grey wool jacket that had not been manufactured since the mid-1970s, carrying no bag, no identification, and no visible sign of agitation. He walked to the counter with the unhurried pace of someone arriving for a scheduled appointment. He placed both hands flat on the surface, and he said calmly, and without any apparent awareness of how impossible the sentence was, that he wanted to report that he had been missing for a while and that he was back now. His name was Thomas Allen Pruitt. He had been declared legally dead by the state of West Virginia on March 14, 1978, 31 years and 174 days before he walked through that door. He was 56 years old at the time of his death declaration. He looked, according to every officer present, every photograph taken that morning, and the formal medical examination conducted 4 hours later, exactly 25 years old. There are cases that disturb you in the way that a news story disturbs you, meaning you feel something for a moment and then it fades because the world keeps moving and you let it. And then there are cases that find a specific crack in the part of your mind that is supposed to keep the impossible at a comfortable distance, and they settle into that crack and widen it, slowly, the way water widens a fracture in stone over years. The case of Thomas Allen Pruitt is the second kind. It is not a case that asks you to believe in something. It is a case that forces you to confront what the documented evidence actually says, and then asks you to explain it, knowing that you cannot, knowing that no one has been able to. 31 years after his certified death, a man who should have been in his mid-50s walked into a police station looking the way he looked in photographs from 1977, and there is a paper trail wide enough to drive a truck through that confirms both facts simultaneously, which means that one of them, or both of them, or something that underlies both of them, operates according to rules that no branch of medicine, law, or science has been able to articulate in the 15 years since it happened. What follows is what the record actually says. The documents, the testimony, the medical examinations, the federal correspondence, the things that the people who were closest to this case said when the recorders were still running, and the official explanations had already collapsed. This is not a story about what might have happened. It is a story about what is documented as having happened, and about the space between that documentation and anything that currently passes for an explanation of it. If you have been carrying this case in the back of your mind, if you encountered it somewhere years ago and it never fully left, you already know why you are still here. And you are about to understand it in a way that is going to make it considerably harder to put down. There is a channel called Unresolved where we do exactly this. We take the cases that the official record closed without closing, the stories that have a beginning and a file number and a cause of death and every formal marking of completion, except the part where any of it actually makes sense, and we sit with them until the details start to speak. If you have never watched this channel before, now is a reasonable moment to subscribe, because what we are building here, case by case and document by document, is a record of the things that happened and were never adequately explained, and you deserve to be part of a community that takes that seriously, instead of asking you to move on. The subscribe button is right there. It takes 2 seconds, and once you are in, you are not alone with these questions anymore. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something directly. When you first heard the title of this video, something specific happened in your body before your mind had a chance to evaluate it. You felt it before you thought it. Leave a comment right now that says, "I felt it before I thought it," if that is what happened, because I think you are going to find, as the comments come in, that you are in very large company, and there is something quietly important about knowing that. Thomas Allen Pruitt was born on June 3, 1952, in the town of Mill Haven, West Virginia, a coal extraction community of approximately 3,000 residents in the southern part of the state. His father worked 31 years in the mines before silicosis took most of his lung function, and his mother worked the reception desk at the county health clinic for 17 years and raised 4 children, of whom Thomas was the second oldest. By every account available, including school records at the Mill Haven County District Archive and employment records held by the West Virginia Department of Labor, Thomas Pruitt was an entirely ordinary young man. He graduated from Mill Haven Consolidated High School in June of 1970, worked briefly at a hardware distribution center, enlisted in the Army in September of 1971, was stationed in West Germany, received an honorable discharge in October of 1973, returned to Mill Haven, and spent the following 3 years working as an electrician's apprentice. His co-workers described him as quiet, reliable, someone who showed up on time and did the work without complaint. He had no criminal record. He had no history of psychiatric treatment. He was 24 years old in the autumn of 1977, and he disappeared sometime during the night of November 8th of that year, and no one who knew him saw him again until 31 years had passed. The disappearance was, at the time, treated as a missing persons case with no particularly unusual characteristics. Thomas had been living in a rented room in a boarding house on Crescent Street, owned by a widow named Mabel Fortescue, who rented 3 rooms to single working men. On the morning of November 9th, 1977, Mabel noticed that Thomas had not come down for breakfast and opened his door with her key. The room was empty, not disturbed, not ransacked, not disordered in any way that suggested violence or a hasty departure. The bed had been slept in. His work clothes were on the chair by the window. His tools were still under the bed. His wallet was still on the dresser. It contained $43, a library card, a photograph of his parents, and his Social Security card. His car was still in the lot behind the house. Thomas Allen Pruitt had apparently risen from his bed sometime during the night, left everything behind, and vanished from the documented world. Mabel Fortescue called the Mill Haven Police Department at 9:15 that morning. The missing persons report was filed under case number MPD 1977-04418. The file is still accessible at the Mill Haven Police Archive and was reviewed as part of the 2009 federal inquiry. It is a thin document. The investigating officer noted that there was no sign of foul play, no indication of emotional distress in the days prior, no known conflict with any other individual, and no obvious motive for voluntary departure. Thomas's older sister, Ruth Pruitt Danforth, drove from Beckley to speak with investigators. His mother, Edna, told police she had spoken with Thomas on the telephone 3 days before his disappearance and that he had seemed entirely normal, that they had discussed Thanksgiving plans, and that he had said he was thinking about saving enough money to move into his own apartment. There was nothing in the conversation, she said, that sounded like a man preparing to leave. The search produced nothing in 1977 and nothing in 1978. In March of 1978, at the petition of his mother and sister, the Circuit Court issued a declaration of presumed death under West Virginia Code, Section 44.5.3. Thomas Allen Pruitt was declared legally dead on March 14, 1978. He was 25 years old. His small estate was settled. His mother kept the photograph from his wallet. And life continued. The 31 years between March 1978 and September 2009 constitute a period during which Thomas Pruitt did not exist in any documented sense anywhere on Earth. This is a precise statement about what investigators found when they searched with the full resources of a federal inquiry, for any trace of his existence during that interval. His social security number was never used. His name never appeared in any record generated by any government agency in any of the 50 states or any foreign country that cooperated with the inquiry. He was not arrested. He was not hospitalized. He did not file taxes, open a bank account, purchase property, register a vehicle, or appear in any database to which investigators had legal access. His fingerprints did not match any print collected from any crime scene in any jurisdiction participating in the automated fingerprint identification system. There is a document in the federal inquiry file, a summary memo dated January 12, 2010, from Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Hume of the FBI Field Office in Charleston, West Virginia, that states in its conclusion paragraph that after exhaustive review of all available records, investigators were unable to establish any documented evidence of the subject's existence, physical presence, or activity during the period from November 1977 to September 2009. The memo uses the phrase "unable to establish" 3 times in 4 pages, which is the kind of repetition that appears in official documents, not for emphasis, but because the writer has genuinely run out of other ways to say that the evidence points to something the document is not equipped to contain. Carl Munier gave a recorded statement 2 days after Thomas walked in that was included in the inquiry file and reviewed by the journalist and researcher Amanda Forsyth, whose 2016 long-form investigation into the Pruitt case, published under the title Interval, remains the most thorough civilian examination of the documented record. Munier described the physical appearance of the man at the counter with a specificity that suggests he had been turning the details over in his mind since the event. He said the man's skin was the skin of someone in his mid-20s, not metaphorically but literally, meaning that the network of fine lines that accumulates around the eyes and mouth over decades of normal human aging was simply absent. He said the hair was dark brown with no grey visible anywhere. He said the hands were steady and the posture upright in the way of a person whose joints have not yet begun the long, slow process of betrayal. He said, in a phrase he used twice, that if you had asked him to guess the age of the man at the counter without any other context, he would have said 24 or 25, and that when he was told, within the hour, that the man had been born in 1952, he stood in the hallway outside the interview room for what he described as a long time without moving and tried to find a way to make the arithmetic work out. He said it did not work out. He said it still does not. The formal medical examination was conducted on the afternoon of September 4, 2009, by Dr. Miriam Castillo of Harlow Falls General Hospital, a physician with 23 years of practice in internal medicine and forensic examination. Dr. Castillo's report, a 16-page document filed under hospital record number HF 2009-09041, is comprehensive in the way that a document produced by someone who suspects they will be asked hard questions later tends to be comprehensive. It covers every biological system. The report finds, across every system examined, markers consistent with a male subject in his mid to late 20s, not approximately consistent, unambiguously consistent, which is the phrase Dr. Castillo used and which she later emphasized when she said that if she had received the same physiological data blind, her clinical assessment would have been of a man between 24 and 28 years of age. She noted that this assessment was irreconcilable with the documentary evidence of the subject's birth date and that she had no clinical explanation to offer for the discrepancy. She then wrote, in a sentence that does not belong to any standard diagnostic framework, that she had been in medicine for 23 years and had never encountered a patient whose body told a story directly contradicted by every document attached to their name. The DNA analysis, completed in November of 2009, confirmed with a probability exceeding 99.97% that the man who walked into the Harlow Falls Police Department was the biological son of Gerald Raymond Pruitt and Edna Louise Pruitt, both deceased by that date. This was corroborated by mitochondrial comparison performed against samples provided by Ruth Pruitt Danforth, Thomas's older sister, who was by then 60 years old. The DNA is not a contested point. It was never contested. Everyone agreed that the biological identity of the man was not in question. What was in question, and what remained in question through the entire formal investigation and every subsequent review, was something that DNA analysis cannot address, which is why the biological confirmation, rather than resolving anything, served primarily to make everything else more difficult to explain. Ruth Pruitt Danforth was contacted by police on the afternoon of September 4th and travelled to the station the following day. She was shown a photograph taken during processing before being brought into the conference room where Thomas was being held. She studied the photograph for what the officer present described as a very long time. Then she said, in a voice the officer's notes describe as flat and quiet, the kind of flat and quiet that means someone is holding something very large, very still, that the man in the photograph looked the way her brother had looked in 1977. Not similar to how he had looked. The way he had looked. When she entered the conference room and Thomas stood up, Ruth sat down in the nearest chair without saying anything for approximately 2 minutes. Then she said his name. He said hers. She asked where he had been. He said he did not know. She asked what that meant. He said he did not know how to explain it in a way that would make sense, and that he had been trying to find a way since he woke up. She asked when he woke up. He said that morning. She asked where. He said on the grass near the highway overpass on Route 19, about 4 miles from the center of Harlow Falls, lying on his side, with damp grass under him and a grey sky above him, and no memory of how he got there or of anything at all between the night he went to sleep in his room on Crescent Street and the moment he opened his eyes on the grass. Ruth did not speak again for several minutes after that. The officer present noted that she appeared to be doing the same arithmetic that Carl Munier had described doing in the hallway, the arithmetic that does not work out. Thomas Pruitt was interviewed under recorded conditions 11 times between September 2009 and March 2010 by a combination of local police, state investigators, and federal agents. The transcripts are included in the inquiry file, though 3 sessions are partially redacted under exemptions relating to ongoing investigative interest, a designation that was renewed twice, most recently in 2019, making those passages still unavailable. What is available is consistent in all the ways that matter. A person constructing a false account over 11 interviews conducted by different questioners over 6 months would be expected to introduce small inconsistencies as the stress of maintaining fabrication accumulated. Thomas Pruitt's account introduced none. Not because his account was detailed and satisfying, but because it was in every session identically limited. He remembered going to sleep. He remembered waking up on the grass. He remembered nothing in between. Neurological testing, including comprehensive MRI imaging reviewed by 3 independent neurologists, found no evidence of amnesia-inducing lesion, no structural abnormality, no indication of the kind of acquired brain injury that produces dissociative gaps in trauma cases. The brain of Thomas Allen Pruitt, like every other biological system examined, presented as the brain of a man in his mid-20s with no significant medical history. If you have been following this and you are now sitting with something uncomfortable, something that is not quite disbelief and not quite acceptance, but is the specific feeling of a mental category starting to fail under pressure, I want to tell you that you are in good company. The federal investigators who spent months on this case felt it. The physicians who examined Thomas felt it. The researchers who came after them felt it. That feeling is not a weakness in your reasoning. It is your reasoning working correctly, registering that it has arrived at the edge of what the available frameworks can hold. Leave a like on this video if you are at that edge right now, because what that like does is tell the platform that this story deserves to reach the people who need to hear it. The question investigators returned to repeatedly was the question of the night itself. November 8, 1977. His co-worker at the electrical contracting business, a man named Philip Wharton, confirmed that the workday had been normal, that they had completed a wiring job on the eastern edge of town, and that they said goodbye in the gravel lot without any indication on Thomas's part that anything was different about that particular Tuesday evening. Thomas himself, when asked to describe his memory of that day, was able to supply details that matched external accounts with a precision investigators noted as further evidence against fabrication. The specific house they had been wiring, the color of the exterior, a problem with a junction box in the master bedroom that had taken longer to resolve than expected. His memory of the day was intact and clear up to a point in the mid-evening when he had been lying in bed reading and had felt the specific tiredness of someone who was going to fall asleep quickly and had set his book on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. And that was the end of the account, the lamp going off. And then the grass and the grey sky, and 31 years later. There is a document in the inquiry file not widely discussed in civilian accounts of the case, partly because it sits in a section requiring navigation through significant procedural paperwork, and partly because its implications tend to produce discomfort in researchers who encounter it. It is an internal memorandum dated November 19, 2009, from Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Hume, addressed to a deputy director whose name is redacted, and classified at a level that means several paragraphs in the available version are replaced entirely with black bars. The portions that are available describe, in the dry language of formal federal correspondence, a secondary investigation Hume had initiated in parallel with the primary inquiry, a search for prior documented cases with substantially similar characteristics. The conclusion paragraph, which is available, states that the secondary search produced 17 preliminary matches in federal and state records going back to 1931, and that further review was being requested to determine whether the matches warranted formal case linkage. That is the last reference to the secondary investigation in any document currently accessible to the public. Whether the linkage was established, whether the 17 matches were pursued, whether the investigation was closed or reclassified, is not known from any document available to any researcher who has worked on the case since. 17. The number sits in the available record without context, without names, without any of the details that would allow a researcher to construct a picture of what it might mean. But its presence, noted by Hume in the same memo where she described the primary investigation as yielding no conventional explanation, suggests that whatever happened to Thomas Pruitt in November of 1977 was not, in the assessment of at least one federal investigator, an entirely isolated occurrence. Amanda Forsyth spent 2 years trying to identify those 17 cases before concluding that the search had produced 3 possible matches and 12 cases that resembled the criteria in some respects but could not be confirmed. The 2 long-interval cases she identified involved individuals declared legally dead who had subsequently reappeared after more than 20 years. Forsyth was unable to obtain medical records for either case sufficient to conduct the kind of physiological comparison possible with Pruitt. But she noted, in the careful language of a researcher who has learned not to overclaim, that certain details in those secondary accounts presented characteristics that, if confirmed by adequate medical documentation, would represent a pattern rather than a series of coincidences. She did not go further than that in print. In a correspondence exchange published on a research forum in 2018, she wrote in a less formal register that she had gone further in her thinking and that what she had arrived at was something she was not prepared to say in a form that would attach her name to it permanently, because the conclusion to which the data pointed, if followed honestly, was not one that any existing framework of explanation could comfortably contain. There is a detail in the 2009 medical examination that Dr. Castillo mentioned in her follow-up interview, and that appears as a single-line item in the appendix of her report without elaboration. It concerns the subject's telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that shorten incrementally with each cell division throughout a human life, and their relative length is one of the biological markers used as an index of cellular aging. Dr. Castillo noted that a sample taken from Thomas Pruitt showed telomere length consistent with the upper range for a male subject in his mid-20s and inconsistent with a male subject of 56 years of age. She included it because she thought completeness mattered more than comfort. When asked what the finding meant to her personally, she paused for long enough that the transcript notes the pause, and then she said that it meant the body had not been through 31 years. Not that it had been through them without aging, that it had not been through them, that wherever Thomas Pruitt had been for 31 years, and she said wherever with a precision that suggested she was choosing the word deliberately rather than idiomatically, the cells had not been keeping count. The cells had not been keeping count. That sentence has appeared in every substantive analysis of the Pruitt case since Forsyth first quoted the interview in 2016, and it appears there not as metaphor and not as poetry, but as the direct statement of a physician describing a clinical finding, which is the thing that makes it so difficult to put down once it has found you. Because the alternative to the cells keeping count is not a medical condition with a name and a mechanism. It is a category of occurrence for which medicine does not currently have instruments. It is the category of the interval between going to sleep with a book on a Tuesday night in November in West Virginia and waking up on wet grass in the grey morning 31 years later, unchanged, unaged, unaccounted for by any system of record that the most thorough federal investigation could bring to bear. Thomas Pruitt was released without charge on September 11, 2009, after a week in what was described officially as voluntary protective housing. He was assisted in applying for a new Social Security number under an administrative provision that exists for individuals whose legal death declarations have been judicially reversed, which his was, by circuit court order, dated September 22, 2009. He was seen regularly by a psychologist named Dr. Carl Whiting at the request of federal investigators. Whiting's summary report describes Thomas as cognitively intact, emotionally stable, in a way that Whiting acknowledged finding somewhat unexpected, and possessed of what he described as a quality of calm acceptance that was either a healthy adaptive response to an incomprehensible situation or something else that he was not in a position to characterize clinically. The phrase "something else" appears in the report once and is not elaborated upon. Whiting later told Forsyth that what he meant by it was a quality in Thomas's manner that he had tried for months to find a clinical name for and had been unable to, a quality that felt less like acceptance than like familiarity, as if Thomas were not adjusting to an extraordinary situation as much as recognizing it, as if some part of him had been in the situation before and knew its texture, and that this impression had stayed with him since the case ended in a way that most cases did not. Thomas Pruitt, in the years following his reappearance, gave no public interviews. He moved to a small town in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, worked for several years at a hardware store, and maintained a quiet and unremarkable life. Forsyth, who made contact through an intermediary in 2014, reported that he declined to participate but did not express hostility. He sent a single written note, which she quotes with his permission, in which he said that he understood why people wanted to understand what had happened, but that he had nothing to add to what was already in the record, because the record was complete in the only way it could be complete. Everything else, he wrote, was the part that did not belong to him to describe. Forsyth said she had read that note many times, and that each time she found the final sentence a little more difficult to set aside. She asked, in her written commentary, what it would mean for there to be a part of a thing that happened to you that did not belong to you to describe. Whether it would mean that the thing had not, in any sense that language can reach, fully happened to you. Whether there was a space, in whatever occurred between November 1977 and September 2009, into which Thomas Allen Pruitt had been received, and from which he had been returned, and whether the terms of that transaction included a boundary he could feel but not cross. Carl Munier, the desk sergeant, retired in 2013. In an informal conversation recorded by a local journalist doing a retrospective on unusual cases in the department's history, he was asked if the Pruitt case still came to mind. He said it came to mind fairly regularly, usually in the early morning when he was not yet fully awake, and his brain had not yet organized itself into the categories it used during daylight hours. He said that in those early morning moments, the case did not feel strange the way it felt strange during ordinary waking consciousness. It felt in that half-awake space perfectly coherent. He said he was never able to remember, once he was fully awake, what the coherence had consisted of, only that it had been there, only that in that space, whatever the interval was, it had made sense. And then the morning finished arriving, and the categories reasserted themselves, and it became impossible again. He said he had talked to other officers who worked the case, and that 2 of them described something similar. The sense, in unguarded moments, that the thing almost made sense. Almost. The almost being the part that stayed. The Harlow Falls Police Department still has Thomas Pruitt's original intake photograph in its archive. It is a standard photograph taken against a plain wall, showing a man with brown hair and clear eyes, and the unlined face of someone in his mid-20s wearing a grey wool jacket. Below the photograph, on the intake form, the date of birth is listed as June 3rd, 1952. The date the photograph was taken is listed as September 4th, 2009. Those 2 pieces of information are separated by a distance of 57 years. The person in the photograph accounts for 25 of them, and no one, in the 15 years since that photograph was taken, has produced a satisfying account of where the other 32 went, or what they contained, or what it means that a human body can pass through them and come out the other side still carrying the coordinates of its beginning rather than the accumulated weight of its years. If this story has found the crack it was looking for in the part of you that keeps the impossible at a distance, if you are now turning something over that you cannot quite put down, you already understand what this channel is for. Leave a like so the platform sends this to the people who need it. Subscribe if you are not already here, because the next case in this series begins with a county in Montana that removed itself from the national census in 1954 and whose residents, when visited by federal enumerators in 1960, described a time frame that did not correspond to the 6 years that had passed on the outside. The records from that visit were classified the following year, and the county is still there and people still live in it, and the discrepancy the 1960 enumerators documented has never been publicly explained. Come back for that one. Bring your willingness to sit with things that do not resolve cleanly, because that willingness is the only honest equipment for the kind of country we are actually living in, the one underneath the documented one, the one where the intervals are real and the cells sometimes forget to count, and a man in a grey wool jacket can walk through a door 57 years into a life he left on a Tuesday night and say, with perfect calm, that he is back now. As if back were a simple word, as if now were something that applied to him the same way it applies to the rest of us.